Dr. Amanda Hayes had been staring at the same data sequence for 3 hours when she first noticed the pattern. Her coffee had gone cold, forgotten beside her keyboard as lines of cosmic background radiation readings scrolled across her monitors at SETI's primary research facility. Most people would have missed it, a subtle ripple in the universe's ancient echo that didn't belong. "Hey, Mark," she called out to her research assistant. "Can you verify something for me?" Her voice cracked from hours of disuse. The graveyard shift at SETI was usually quiet, just how she liked it. Mark wheeled his chair over, his typical smirk fading as he looked at her screen. "That's weird." Running it through the filter again. Amanda nodded, her fingers already flying across the keyboard. The pattern remained. "It's not random noise. Look at the periodicity." She pulled up a comparison chart. "Whatever this is, it's getting closer." The next 12 hours became a blur of verification processes, peer reviews, and increasingly urgent phone calls. By sunset, Amanda found herself in a windowless Pentagon conference room, facing a panel of military officials whose stern expressions made her stomach churn. "Dr. Hayes," General Richards began, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lighting. "You're telling us this signal suggests an intelligent predator that hunts by tracking electromagnetic emissions." "Yes." Amanda stood, approaching the digital display. "We've identified a pattern in the cosmic background radiation that shows, well, holes. Spots where the radiation just stops, like something's consuming it." She switched to the next slide. "These gaps correlate perfectly with the locations of known alien civilizations that went dark over the past millennium. We always assumed they'd destroyed themselves, but..." She let the implications hang in the air. A murmur rippled through the room. Admiral Chen leaned forward. "And you're certain this pattern is approaching Earth?" "At its current velocity, we have perhaps 3 months." Amanda pulled up the final simulation. Each civilization it encountered went silent in exactly the same way. A complete cessation of all electromagnetic emissions. The ones that didn't, she swallowed hard. "We've found what we think are their remains, just debris fields where their planets should be." The room erupted in overlapping voices until General Richards raised his hand for silence. "Options. We go dark," Amanda said simply. "Completely dark. No radio, no television, no cell phones, no electronics that could emit any significant signature. We need to make Earth look like a pre-industrial planet." "That's impossible," someone scoffed from the back. "The global economy would collapse." "The global economy won't matter much if we're all dead," Amanda countered. She'd spent hours preparing for these objections. "Look, humanity existed without electronics before. We can do it again, temporarily. We have something none of those other civilizations had." Warning. The debate raged for hours. Amanda's throat was raw from arguing, from explaining, from pleading. As the sun began to rise, General Richards finally stood. "We'll take this to the President. Dr. Hayes, you're coming with us." He paused, fixing her with a steady gaze. "If you're wrong about this, it'll be the end of your career." "If I'm wrong, I'll gladly flip burgers for the rest of my life," she replied. "But if I'm right, and we do nothing, there won't be any careers left to end." The next week passed in a whirlwind of classified briefings, international emergency sessions, and frantic planning. Amanda watched as her discovery raced up the chains of command, across borders, breaking down political barriers through sheer existential terror. 10 days after she first spotted the pattern, Amanda stood in her lab for the last time. Mark was shutting down the equipment, his usual joking manner subdued. "Ready?" he asked, hand hovering over the main power switch. Amanda looked at her life's work, the computers and instruments that had led her to this moment. "Do it." The screens went dark, one by one. Across the planet, others were doing the same. Television stations broadcast their final warnings. Cell networks began their scheduled shutdowns. The Internet, humanity's greatest achievement, prepared for its temporary death. In the parking lot, Amanda looked up at the stars, clearer now without the electric glow of the city. Somewhere up there, something was hunting them. But for the first time in her life, she felt a fierce pride in her species. Humanity wasn't going down without a fight, even if that fight meant learning to be silent. She started her car, one of the last times she'd be able to do so, and headed home to prepare for the dark days ahead. Dr. Jack Morrison watched the alien ship descend through his old brass telescope, a relic that had become unexpectedly valuable in recent months. From his vantage point at the repurposed Mount Wilson Observatory, the vessel's crystalline structure caught the morning sunlight, sending prismatic reflections across the unusually quiet Los Angeles basin below. "Right on schedule," he muttered, making a note in his leather-bound journal. The government had anticipated this. Extraterrestrial civilizations would eventually notice Earth's sudden silence. That's why Jack, a leading behavioral psychologist, had been positioned here with a carefully crafted cover story. The ship landed precisely where the hastily established protocols had indicated, in the Mojave Desert, far from major population centers. Jack packed his mechanical typewriter, no electronic emissions, into his restored 1965 Mustang and began the drive out to the designated meeting point. 3 military helicopters, specially modified to minimize their electronic signatures, were already on site when he arrived. Dr. Zixtal emerged from the ship like a living mercury sculpture, its fluid form settling into a vaguely humanoid shape that towered over the welcoming committee. "Dr. Morrison," General Richards nodded tersely. "You're up." Jack stepped forward, forcing his face into a mask of academic curiosity rather than the dread he felt. Everything hinged on this performance. "Dr. Zixtal," he began, extending his hand in greeting. "Welcome to Earth. I apologize for our primitive state. We've experienced some technical difficulties recently." The alien's silver surface rippled with what Jack interpreted as amusement. When it spoke, its voice emerged like wind through crystal. "Technical difficulties that affected your entire planet simultaneously. Fascinating. The Galactic Council is most concerned about this unprecedented situation." Over the next few hours, Jack led Dr. Zixtal through the carefully orchestrated tour. They visited a nearby town where people went about their business using conspicuously old-fashioned methods. Horse-drawn carriages, manual tools, and paper messages. Every detail had been rehearsed for months. "Your species appears to be adapting remarkably well," Dr. Zixtal observed, its surface displaying shifting patterns that Jack was learning to read as expressions. "Though I must admit, I find it strange that humans would so readily abandon their technological dependencies." Jack felt sweat bead on his forehead, despite the desert chill. "We're a surprisingly resilient species. When the electromagnetic disturbances began, we simply adjusted." "Electromagnetic disturbances." Dr. Zixtal's form rippled with interest. "Our scans detected no such anomalies." Jack's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't in the script. "Perhaps your instruments are calibrated differently than our more primitive devices were," he offered, silently cursing himself for the slip. The alien's surface swirled with what might have been suspicion. "Perhaps, though it seems unlikely that such disturbances would affect only human technology." Before Jack could respond, a sound split the air. A car alarm, forbidden under the silence protocols. Someone's battery had retained enough charge to trigger it. Dr. Zixtal's form shifted rapidly, sensor arrays emerging from its surface. "Interesting," it said. "A brief electromagnetic pulse. The first I'd detected since arriving." Jack forced a laugh, mind racing. "Ah, yes. Residual charge in older vehicles. We're still decommissioning them as we find them. Speaking of which," he gestured toward the town's museum. "We've prepared an exhibition on human technological history that might interest you." As they walked away from the dying sound, Jack caught sight of General Richards' face. The message was clear. They'd just dodged a bullet, but they couldn't afford another mistake. The rest of the day passed in careful navigation of half-truths and orchestrated demonstrations. By sunset, Jack was mentally exhausted from maintaining the charade. As he watched Dr. Sixtel's ship rise into the darkening sky, the alien returning to orbit to process initial findings, he allowed himself a moment of hope. Then he saw it, a tiny flash in the distant hills. Someone had taken a digital photograph, probably a civilian who'd managed to hide a smartphone during the mandatory collection. Jack's blood ran cold. Dr. Sixtel's ship paused in its ascent, hovering. They were about to learn just how good humans really were at improvising. Emily Parker stood before her high school class, the scratch of chalk on blackboard replacing the familiar hum of digital screens. Sunlight streamed through the windows of Roosevelt High, the absence of fluorescent lighting lending the classroom an almost Victorian atmosphere. "Today," she announced, her voice carrying across the attentive faces, "we're going to learn how to calculate longitude using just a sextant and chronometer." She held up the brass instruments, now worth their weight in gold. Your grandparents might have called this antique. Now it's survival. The teenagers, usually restless without their phones, leaned forward. Nothing like an apocalyptic threat to motivate learning, Emily thought wryly. "Miss Parker." Jessica Martinez raised her hand. "My dad said the aliens are watching us again. Their ship was over Portland last night." Emily carefully maintained her composure. All the more reason to master these skills. Remember, we're showing them how humans adapt. She didn't mention the real reason, that their survival might depend on these obsolete skills sooner than anyone wanted to admit. After class, Emily packed her teaching materials into a leather satchel. No synthetic fibers, nothing that might create static electricity, and headed to her brother's workshop. The familiar smell of machine oil and wood shavings greeted her as she entered the converted warehouse. "How's the Victorian tech genius today?" she called out. James Parker emerged from behind a towering mechanical computer made of gears and levers, his hands stained with grease. Once a Silicon Valley executive, he'd become the town's most valuable resource after the silence began. "Just finished another Babbage engine," he grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sure, it's slower than a pocket calculator, but it doesn't emit a single electromagnetic wave." His smile faded slightly. "How are the kids doing?" Emily set her satchel down, picking up a brass gear and turning it in her hands. "Better than the adults, honestly. They treat it like a game. Who can master the old ways fastest?" She paused. "James, do you ever think about your old life? The company?" "You mean, do I miss my billion-dollar tech empire?" He laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Sometimes. But then I remember what Amanda Hayes showed us in those readings, and suddenly 19th century engineering seems pretty appealing." A bell rang outside. Actual brass bells now marked time in their town. Emily moved to the window, watching people move through the streets. Horse-drawn carriages shared the roads with bicycles. Children played with hoops and sticks instead of video games. Neighbors actually talked to each other instead of texting. "It's like we're living in 2 centuries at once," she mused. Teaching calculus with an abacus in the morning, then using that knowledge to calculate potential asteroid impacts in the afternoon. James joined her at the window. Speaking of which, he pulled the folded paper from his pocket. Handwritten, like everything else now. The mechanical telegraph network picked up something interesting. The military's testing new detection systems up in Alaska. Completely analog, but they say it can spot objects at twice the range of our old digital systems. Emily felt a chill despite the warm day. They're expecting something. We all are. James returned to his mechanical computer. That's why we need to get these calculations done. The astronomical division needs them by sunset. Emily pulled up a stool, reaching for a slate and chalk. As she worked through the complex mathematical equations, doing by hand what computers once did in microscans, she thought about her students. They'd grown up in a digital world, but they were learning to live in an analog one. Humanity was walking a tightrope between centuries, between technologies, between survival and extinction. The chalk scratched against slate, gears turned in James's machine, and somewhere above, silent watchers tried to make sense of a civilization that had seemingly regressed centuries overnight. But beneath the apparent regression, humanity was adapting, preparing, and perhaps most importantly, remembering that progress wasn't always about moving forward. Sometimes, survival meant knowing when to take a step back. Outside, the bells rang again, marking another hour in Earth's new dark age. Captain Michael Torres lay flat against the cool desert earth, his eyes fixed on the mechanical gauges before him. The array of brass instruments, spread out in a careful pattern across the New Mexico desert, looked like something from a steampunk fantasy. But there was nothing fantastic about their purpose. "Movement on bearing 270, whispered Lieutenant Sarah Chen, her hand steady on the elaborate crystalline detector they'd developed. Essentially a precision-grown quartz matrix that responded to gravitational disturbances. No electronics, no emissions, just physics and human ingenuity. "Range?" Michael asked, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. "Hard to tell." Sarah adjusted the calibration rings on the device. "But it's big. Bigger than anything we've tracked before." Michael pulled out his mechanically printed star charts, another innovation born of necessity. The positions of known celestial bodies were marked in precise detail, updated daily using observations from their network of modified telescopes. Whatever they were detecting wasn't supposed to be there. "Control, this is Watchpoint 7. He whispered into a tube that looked like an ordinary brass pipe. It was actually part of a sophisticated acoustic transmission network, carrying sound waves through a series of carefully designed chambers and resonators. They discovered that certain frequencies couldn't be detected by their mysterious hunter. The response came back moments later, vibrating through the brass. "Report. We have anomalous movement in Sector 12. Request confirmation from other stations." The wait seemed eternal. Michael used the time to check their other instruments. The wind direction indicators, strips of silk that could detect the slightest atmospheric disturbance. The seismographs, refined versions of Victorian designs that could detect movements in space through their gravitational effect on Earth's crust. Even the modified barometers that tracked minute changes in air pressure caused by passing objects. Finally, the tube vibrated again, confirmed by watchpoints 3 and 5. Triangle position puts the object at approximately 40 million miles, moving sunward. Michael felt his throat tighten. That was closer than anything they'd detected before. He looked at Sarah, saw the same recognition in her eyes. They'd drilled for this, but the reality was different. Terrifying. "Initial calculations suggest it will pass within 10 million miles of Earth," Sarah reported, her fingers moving across the mechanical calculator's dials. "Unless it changes course." "It'll change course," Michael said grimly. "They always do." They'd studied the patterns, learned from the remnants of dead civilizations. The hunter never passed by. It was drawn to technology like a moth to flame. Earth's sudden silence might have confused it, but they couldn't maintain the deception forever. A new vibration came through the tube. "All stations, initiate protocol echo." Sarah immediately began adjusting their instruments, while Michael pulled out a sealed envelope, actual paper like everything else now. Inside were their echo protocol instructions, which they'd memorized but kept as backup. The papers were treated with chemicals that would dissolve them in seconds if needed. As they worked, Michael caught movement in his peripheral vision. A dust devil spun across the desert floor, except the wind was blowing in the wrong direction. He watched as it moved with unnatural precision, avoiding rocks and cacti. "Sarah," he whispered, "look at your silk strips." She glanced at the wind indicators. All of them pointed in different directions, despite being inches apart. "That's not possible. Unless something's affecting local gravity fields." Michael grabbed his signaling mirror. No radio, not even for emergencies. He flashed a quick series of dots and dashes toward the observation post 2 miles east. The response came back immediately. "We see it too. Multiple anomalies across the sector." This was new. In all their observations, all their studies of past hunting patterns, They'd never seen anything like this. The hunter wasn't just passing by. It was testing them, probing their defenses with microscopic gravitational fluctuations. "Control," Michael spoke into the tube, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Recommend immediate initiation of Phase 2. The response was immediate. "Confirmed. God help us all." As the sun set over the desert, Michael watched more dust devils appear, moving with intelligent purpose across the landscape. Humanity's game of hide and seek was about to become a lot more complicated. Hannah Cooper had spent her entire life reading the Kansas sky. 3 generations of farmers before her had passed down the knowledge: how to spot a tornado before the clouds began to turn, how to smell incoming rain, how to feel the change in air pressure that meant trouble was coming. But nothing in her family's weather wisdom had prepared her for this. "That ain't natural," her father muttered beside her on the farmhouse porch, staring at the evening sky. The sunset was wrong. The colors bent in ways that defied physics, creating patterns that made her eyes hurt if she looked too long. "The animals knew first," Hannah said, watching their horses press against the back of their stalls, refusing to come out. The chickens had gone silent 2 days ago. Even the crickets had stopped chirping, just like before a big storm, except there ain't no storm coming, her father finished. He pulled out his grandfather's barometer, no digital weather stations anymore, and tapped it gently. The needle spun in a complete circle. Never seen it do that before. Hannah checked her own instruments, the collection of mechanical weather monitoring devices she'd assembled since the silence began. Everything was showing impossible readings, air pressure fluctuating wildly, wind directions changing by the second, temperature gradients that violated everything she knew about thermodynamics. A flash of movement caught her eye. One of their wheat fields was rippling, but only in a perfect circle about 20 feet across. The rest remained still in the windless evening. "Dad," she pointed. "Look." They watched as the circle moved through the wheat, leaving the stalks unharmed but somehow changed. They seemed to bend at angles that shouldn't be possible, like the space around them had been twisted. Hannah pulled out her notebook, paper like everything else now, and began sketching the pattern. She'd been documenting these anomalies for weeks, ever since the military had quietly reached out to farmers across the country, asking them to report anything unusual. "It's getting bolder," she said, adding notes about time and weather conditions. First it was just the weird lights at night, then the gravitational spots in the north field where things fell up instead of down. Now this. Her father's weathered face was grim. "They say anything about my report from yesterday?" Hannah nodded. "The water in the creek flowing backward for exactly 10 minutes. They've seen it in 3 other locations, always 10 minutes, always at the same time of day." A new sound made them both turn. A deep thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wheat circle disappeared, but now the entire field began to glow with a faint blue luminescence. Hannah's hand shook as she documented this new phenomenon. The military's instructions had been clear: record everything, no matter how strange. Their mechanical instruments might be primitive compared to what they'd had before, but they were their only way of tracking the entity's activities. "Hannah," her father's voice was tight. "The barn." She looked up. The massive structure, built by her great-grandfather, was starting to shimmer like a mirage. For a moment, she could see through it, as if the space it occupied was being stretched thin. "Inside," she ordered, grabbing her father's arm. "We need to send a message." In the farmhouse basement, Hannah cranked up their mechanical telegraph, a network that connected key farms across the country. Her fingers flew across the key, sending out the coded message they'd hoped they'd never have to use. Phase 2. Confirmation at Site 274. Spatial distortion evident. The response came back immediately. Multiple confirmations. All observers initiate Protocol Echo. Repeat. Protocol Echo now active. Hannah looked at her father. They'd drilled for this, but the reality was terrifying. Protocol Echo meant the hunter wasn't just probing anymore. It was making its move. "Time to wake up the old ways," her father said quietly, moving toward the locked cabinet in the corner. Inside were weapons their ancestors would have recognized, and a few they wouldn't have. The military had been busy combining ancient principles with modern materials. Outside, the thrumming grew louder as the night sky continued to twist itself into impossible shapes. Benjamin West stood in his converted missile silo, surrounded by the gentle clicking of mechanical computers and the whisper of paper messages moving through pneumatic tubes. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd made billions developing quantum computers, now relying on technology that predated electricity. "Status report," he called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. The massive room, once filled with nuclear weapons, now housed row after row of mechanical calculating engines, each one a masterpiece of brass and steel. "Western Seaboard reporting multiple anomalies," replied Ana Rodriguez, her hands flying over the mechanical keyboard of her Babbage engine. "Gravitational distortions increasing in frequency. The San Francisco hub reports spatial warping visible to the naked eye." Benjamin moved to the central mapping table, where brass markers tracked known distortions across a massive paper map of North America. The pattern was clear now. The hunter was systematically testing every major population center, looking for signs of the technology it craved. "Sir." A young operator ran up, clutching a paper message. "East Coast Defense Network reports critical readings. Something big is forming over the Atlantic." Benjamin's heart raced as he read the message. The mechanical sensors they placed along the coastline were reporting unprecedented gravitational fluctuations. If the calculations were correct, how long until it reaches the coast? He demanded. 3 hours, assuming current speed. Benjamin felt the weight of billions of lives on his shoulders. The East Coast had to be warned, but using any modern communication method would give away their deception. The hunter would know they weren't as primitive as they appeared. He moved to the massive brass telescope mounted in the silo's observation dome. Through it, he could see the night sky twisting above, stars bending in ways that hurt his eyes. The hunter was getting desperate, becoming less subtle in its attempts to provoke a response. "Sir," Anna called out, her voice tense. "The New York hub is requesting permission to initiate emergency protocols. They got 8 million people in the danger zone." Benjamin closed his eyes, remembering the day he shut down his satellite network. Over 1,000 high-tech eyes in the sky, now being used by the hunter to search for signs of human technology. His own creation turned against humanity. "Authorization denied," he said finally. "We stick to mechanical signals. Start the warning chain." The room burst into activity. Operators began cranking handles on huge mechanical transmitters, sending carefully coded vibrations through the ground. Others deployed the visual signal network, precisely positioned mirrors and lights that could relay messages across vast distances using prearranged codes. "Time to first warning reaching Manhattan?" he asked. 47 minutes using the ground wave network. Another 30 to complete the evacuation signal chain. It would be close. Too close. But using their modern emergency broadcast system would be signing humanity's death warrant. Benjamin moved to his private office, a small room filled with maps and mechanical calculators. On his desk sat a single photograph, taken the day he'd opened his first quantum computing facility. Next to it lay the brass and copper device that had replaced those computers, slower by a factor of millions, but invisible to the hunter. A series of sharp bells rang through the complex, the pattern they'd all dreaded hearing. Multiple stations were reporting the same thing. The hunter had stopped testing. It was preparing to strike. "Sir." Another operator appeared at his door. "Dr. Martinez is on the mechanical line. She says the weapons are ready." Benjamin picked up the speaking tube. "Rachel, tell me you have good news." The response came back, carried by carefully modulated sound waves. "The tests worked. All of them. We can fight back." For the first time in months, Benjamin felt a glimmer of hope. He turned to the observation dome one last time, watching the writhing sky above. Humanity had been forced back to the mechanical age, but they hadn't gone back empty-handed. They'd brought their knowledge of modern physics, material science, and engineering with them. "Begin final preparations," he ordered. "It's time to show our visitor that sometimes the old ways are the best ways." The silo hummed with activity as humanity prepared for its strangest battle yet, fighting a cosmic horror with Victorian-era technology. Dr. Rachel Martinez stood in her underground workshop, surrounded by what looked like Leonardo da Vinci's fever dreams come to life. Massive mechanical constructs of brass, copper, and engineered carbon fiber filled the sprawling space. Each device was a hybrid of ancient principles and modern material science, designed to fight an enemy that hunted technology itself. "Load the resonance engine," she ordered, watching as her team cranked the massive springs into position. The device looked like a giant tuning fork crossed with a medieval siege weapon, its prongs made of perfectly engineered crystal. "Maximum tension achieved," reported her chief engineer, Thomas Wright, his hand steady on the calibration wheels. "Are you sure about these frequencies, Dr. Martinez?" Rachel checked her calculations one final time. Pages of complex equations worked out by hand, checked and rechecked by mechanical computers. The hunter's spatial distortions operate on predictable wavelengths. We can't track it electronically, but we can disrupt it mechanically. The crystals began to hum as the tension increased. They discovered that certain crystalline structures, when stressed in precise ways, could generate interference patterns that affected the hunter's ability to manipulate spacetime. No electronics required, just precise engineering and the right materials. "First test ready," Thomas announced, targeting the anomaly over Sector 7. Rachel moved to the observation port, watching as they aimed the massive device at a patch of sky, where reality seemed to bend and twist. At her signal, Thomas released the tension. The crystal prongs vibrated with a deep tone that seemed to shake the very air. Above them, the spatial distortion flickered and temporarily vanished. For a moment, the sky looked normal again. "It works," Rachel breathed, already scribbling notes. "Quick, reset for another test before it reforms." But as they worked to reload the device, a new sound filled the air. A deep, resonant tone that made their teeth vibrate. The hunter had felt their attack and was responding. "Everyone down," Rachel shouted as reality rippled around them. Tools fell upward, gravity briefly reversing before snapping back to normal. Papers swirled in impossible patterns, forming complex geometric shapes before shredding themselves. When the chaos subsided, Rachel pulled herself up using a workbench. "Status report. The resonance engine is intact," Thomas called back. "But that response, it's learning, adapting to our frequency." Rachel rushed to her drafting table, where detailed technical drawings covered every surface. Each one represented a different weapon design, combining principles from throughout human history. Archimedes' death ray redesigned with modern optics, Tesla's earthquake machine rebuilt with advanced materials, even ancient Chinese seismic detectors modified to sense gravitational waves. "Begin production on all variants," she ordered, sending runners to different parts of the vast facility. "If it can adapt to one frequency, we'll hit it with 1,000. The workshop came alive with activity. Forges blazed as they shaped special alloys. Precision lathes spun as they crafted perfect crystalline structures. Every device was mechanical, powered by springs, pressure, or carefully controlled chemical reactions. Message from command. A runner appeared, holding a paper note. "The hunter is massing over the Atlantic. We have less than 2 hours." Rachel looked at her life's work spread out before her. Decades of physics and engineering knowledge, turned toward creating weapons that couldn't be detected by their enemy. Some called it regression, going back to mechanical technology. She called it evolution. "Begin distributing the weapons to all defense points," she ordered. "And get me a line to Benjamin West. He needs to know we're ready." As her team rushed to comply, Rachel picked up a small brass device from her desk, her first successful design. It looked simple, almost primitive, but its internal workings represented the perfect fusion of ancient wisdom and modern science. "You hunt technology," she whispered, watching the sky continue to twist above their hidden facility. "But humanity's greatest weapon has always been our ability to adapt." The deep, resonant tone came again, stronger this time. The hunter was done testing. It was preparing for its final attack. Rachel smiled grimly. Let it come. Humanity was ready to fight back with the most dangerous weapons of all human ingenuity and the forgotten knowledge of ages past. The sky above New York City looked like shattered glass, reality fracturing into crystalline shards as the hunter made its final approach. Dr. Amanda Hayes stood atop the Empire State Building, her brass telescope trained on the phenomenon. After months of hiding, of waiting, everything had led to this moment. "Pattern confirmed," she called out, her voice carried through speaking tubes to the command center below. The gravitational fluctuations matched the recordings from the dead civilizations. It's starting its harvest cycle. Across the city, mechanical transmitters clattered to life, sending the signal that would coordinate humanity's response. In Kansas, Hannah Cooper watched her wheat fields ripple with impossible geometries as she activated the ground wave sensors. In the converted missile silo, Benjamin West's mechanical computers clicked and whirred, calculating firing solutions. "All stations report ready," crackled Captain Michael Torres's voice through the acoustic network. His teams had positioned Rachel's weapons at strategic points around the globe, each one tuned to a different frequency. Dr. Jack Morrison, standing beside the alien scientist, Dr. Zickstall in a protected bunker, finally broke his long deception. "I apologize for the subterfuge," he said as the alien's mercury-like form rippled with surprise. "But we needed everyone, including your people, to believe we'd regress technologically." "You knew what was coming." Dr. Zickstall's crystalline voice held new understanding. "Your silence wasn't submission. It was preparation." Above them, the hunter began its final descent. The air itself seemed to scream as space-time twisted and bent. Buildings stretched like taffy before snapping back into shape. Gravity reversed and shifted, but the city's inhabitants held firm in their shelters, prepared for this moment. "Now," Amanda's voice rang through the network. Rachel Martinez's resonance engines activated simultaneously across the globe. Each one struck a different note in a carefully composed symphony of destruction. The crystalline structures vibrated, sending waves of interference through the hunter's gravitational field. The entity reacted violently. The sky erupted in impossible colors as it tried to maintain its hold on local spacetime. But humanity wasn't finished. Emily Parker's students, trained in the old ways, began coordinating the ground teams using flags and mirrors, adapting their signals as the hunter disrupted each frequency they used. James's mechanical computers calculated each shift in the entity's defenses, allowing them to adjust their attacks in real time. Second phase, Benjamin West commanded through the acoustic network. Ancient siege weapons, rebuilt with modern materials, launched specially designed crystals into the distorted space above. Each one was tuned to resonate with the hunter's own gravitational manipulations, turning its strength against itself. The hunter's form became visible for the first time, a vast, geometric nightmare that hurt the eyes to look at. It tried to retreat, to escape back to the space between stars, but Hannah's network of farms had created a web of gravitational sensors that tracked its every movement. Final phase, Amanda ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "All stations, execute Protocol Omega." Rachel's masterwork activated, thousands of mechanical devices, each one harmless alone, but together creating a synchronized attack that targeted the fundamental frequencies of spacetime itself. The hunter had evolved to detect and destroy electronic civilization. It had never faced an enemy that fought back with the combined knowledge of humanity's entire technological history. The sky screamed one final time. Reality twisted, stretched, and then snapped back into place with an audible crack. The hunter's form dissolved, Torn apart by its own gravitational manipulations, its remains scattered across the solar system. Silence fell over Earth, not the fearful silence of prey hiding from a predator, but the triumphant silence of victory. "We did it," Amanda whispered, lowering her telescope. "We actually did it." Around the world, humans emerged from their shelters, looking up at a sky that was once again simply blue. The hunter was gone, destroyed by the very civilization it had tried to prey upon. "What happens now?" Dr. Zixtal asked, its form reflecting the restored sunlight. Jack Morrison smiled, watching as people began to restore power to their cities. "Now we share what we've learned. Your council needs to know that technology isn't just about advancement. Sometimes survival means remembering where we came from." Above them, the first radio signals in months began to pulse outward into space, not in fear, but in triumph. Humanity had faced extinction and emerged stronger, armed with both the wisdom of the past and the knowledge of the future. The silence was finally, gloriously, broken.